My name's Hugh McLean, and that's all I'm going to say about myself. But you know, when Vikas Portas spoke to me earlier this year, he said, would you do a talk on youth activism? And I said to him, do you realize I've just got this free bus pass that arrived in the post that morning? And the bus pass, the free bus pass, is something you get when you turn 60. So I thought this is a little strange. But anyway, he said that would be a very good opening line. So I used it. I hope you thought it was a good one. So I don't think, needless to say, that youth activism is something that we have to be young before we can have a meaningful conversation about it. Activism is essentially a rejection of powerlessness. It's meant to put its message out there and clearly, and it's meant to be something that we talk about it. And if we look at the youth activism that we've seen in recent years, that all of us will know, I think we can see that not all youth of this generation have succumbed to what Navi Dillon calls waithood. There's a period of life that he calls waithood. And this is what a lot of young people end up in. They wait for education, some of them. Then they wait for jobs. Then they wait for housing. And there's this long, extended, bewildering period of waithood. We might add to that some young people have to wait for an end to war. Some young people are waiting for residential status or citizenship. And others, as we will see, are waiting to get out of jail. So what I want to do is go through a few examples about young people that are from these generations without fear, look at them, and then think about together what they might teach us about activism and perhaps about youth, so that we can think about how we strengthen activism and make it more determined and more effective in the goals that it has. So 2010, 2011, student riots in Chile, you might have heard of. The student demonstrations at that point were enormously inventive. They involved everything from kiss-ins in the street, huge crowds as you can see, to flash mobs that danced to Lady Gaga's Judas or Michael Jackson's Thriller. There's huge flash mobs to relays around Parliament. And the demonstrations were essentially against the privatization of the Chilean education system, with which the Pinochet, General Pinochet, the dictatorship that had come in after Salvador Allende was overthrown and killed in '73, they instituted privatization and liberalization of the economy across a huge scale. And along with that was a loss of democratic control that people had fought for and that they felt that they had. And because that dictatorship was so brutal, it was only children in this period. From the 2006, there was a revolution they called the Penguin Revolutions, because all the school kids had black jackets and white shirts, and they were all on the march, and there were thousands of them. And this is the same generation that 5 or 6 years later had gone into university, and they started this pushback against privatization of education, which has resulted in huge household debt. Huge household debt. People were mortgaging their homes virtually to educate their children. And they felt that it wasn't necessary of the kind of quality that they wanted. So they pushed back against that, and they wanted free education. So that was part of a whole process that led to the fall of the government. And these young people, the leaders, let me move on. The leaders of this, you see two of them here. Camilo Vallejo was the head of the the Communist Party, and Giorgio Jackson started his own party. Both of them are in government now, along with one or two other of the youth activists from that generation. So there has been a social change, and this student movement was quite successful in that it got into government. I think now they're discovering just how difficult it is, in fact, to reverse 30 years of neoliberal privatization. It's a lot easier said than done when you get down to it. So right across the Pacific, on the other end of the ocean, in Hong Kong, at about the same time, a group of young students in schools in Hong Kong set up a movement called Scholarism. They look young now. This is a few, 2-3 years back, but they must have been 12, 13 then, when they set up this organization. And that was to resist the imposition of what was called moral and national education. Whenever a government's going to do something they don't like, they'll call it moral and national and usually tag the word education to it. And they decided to organize against the imposition of moral national education in Hong Kong that was imposed by the Beijing government. And they started off as a school students movement, but it grew. I think at one point almost 800,000 young students out on strike. They had marches of up to 100,000 people, and it led up to what has been called, and what you probably all remember, 2015, late 2015, the umbrella movement. Everyone had umbrellas, probably started off against the rain or the sun, but it turned into an emblem of this movement. And broadly, it was about a whole population, the whole population of the Hong Kong majority, pushing back against what they saw as an attack on their democracy. And Joshua Wong at that point emerged as this young leader, this small guy with this hugely powerful way of speaking. And what he said was that people should not be afraid of their government. A government should be afraid of their people. So this was also a fearless generation. They had an enormously powerful message. But China being China, these guys are in jail. They've just gone back. They were out on bail, but Joshua Wong and a few others are in jail again for a few more months. And in the recent by-election, the democratic movement in Hong Kong has lost its majority. It was able at least to veto legislation in the parliament. So there's a loss actually for this movement for the moment, but they're still strong and still continue. So I'm South African, as you might have heard. There's a group in South Africa called Equal Education. They are a very exciting organization of young people. They've just had their 10th birthday, so they're 10 years old, started organizing in 2008, and they started off very, very with practical issues, fixing the windows of a school, fixing the roof. And interestingly, they were organized by a group of progressive Jewish students at that point in Habonim, which had a progressive faction, and they went out to the township to do Thursday afternoon reading classes. I remember I went to one of the earlier ones. So they've had an activist training component, but their campaigns that they've picked up have been huge. They're organized, I think, in 4 or 5 of the 9 provinces now, and they have tremendous momentum. They raise money, but they are always commenting on on education reform. They've had a campaign against late coming in schools. They've had a campaign for the implementation of norms and standards, and essentially what gives them their drive is to push back a very unequal system of education, which now, 30 years almost, after the democratic revolution and liberation of our country, still has huge problems and still isn't fixed. So this activism of theirs, of course, there wouldn't be such a receptive attitude to this activism had it not been for the Soweto Students' Uprising 1976, 35 or so years before, if my maths is correct. And I just wanted to recall 2 of the leaders of this movement, Tsietsi Mashinini and Khotso Siatlolo. And both of these leaders they were isolated from the movement. They went into exile quite young. Siatlolo was shot twice. He spent the most of the 90s in prison. Tsietsi Mashinini died in Liberia, I think, in 1990, just before he was due to return to the country. And Siatlolo died in 2004 in Soweto in poverty. Afterwards, of course, there's a huge move to reclaim them, but I think it's a lesson for activism, that somehow we can forget the people that actually started things. And this was an uprising that changed a country. This region that we're in now, the Arab region, of course, is not without its share of incredibly brave activists. And here you have a picture of Ahed Tamimi. Who's heard of Ahed Tamimi? Ahed Tamimi is on trial at the moment. This is her here, with the wonderful big hair. And she, a few months back, became a cause célèbre on Twitter for slapping a soldier. It was called the slap that changed the world, but I think it really did a lot to place the struggles of the Palestinian people on the map. She's in jail at the moment, but here she is on a visit to South Africa with Equal Education. She's there with family and a few other activists, and this to me was really interesting because I think it shows the essential internationalist reach of these struggles, that they're appealing. They don't only matter to the young people that are fighting those fights, but they actually matter to people that are elsewhere who they inspire. Here's Ahed at her trial. She is 16. She faces a 10-year sentence. She's likely to be out when she's 26. Truly a person without fear. So I should say, actually, that there are probably up to 500 underage Palestinians in prison or in detention at the moment. And I'm sure she wouldn't want us to overlook any of the issues that they are facing as well. So a lot of the activism in this region, because it's so dangerous, has moved online. So here we have three superstars of social media. The first one actually is Yana Tamimi. She's the younger cousin of Ahed. It's an activist family. She started posting little videos on her Facebook page when she was 7. I think she has about 300,000 followers now. You can look her up. She's on Twitter. And she's only 11 or 12 at the moment. The chap in the middle is Hussam al-Malaiki. He's from Taiz in the Yemen. And Taiz is just on the border of the Houthi region and the Hadi coalition. So just on the edge, a lot of contestation, and he tweets about bombs that he hears and things that are going on. He was 15 when he started tweeting. He's 17 now. And of course, Mohammed Najem, who is 15 and who tweets the most devastating things from Eastern Ghouta in Damascus. And he shows pictures of his school, he speaks to young people whose sisters were just killed the night before in bombing raids, so you can also follow him. Of course, it's impossible to tell whether these people are legitimate, but when you see young people, I think you get this huge sense of authenticity. I just want to say before I move on, we should pause here, actually. Let me go back, because it's quite possible that these young people won't live to see the ends of the struggles that are shaping their lives now. They live in incredibly difficult situations. So I think we should be aware of that. So yes, the US, we were all inspired, I think, this morning by the fabulous students from Parkland. I think the amazing thing about the US possibly has something to do with the situation they're facing, but the activism we see in the US is very encouraging and exciting at the moment. So we've had this tremendous movement recently of the Parkland students. I think their intervention, regardless of what happens, it's definitely changed that gun debate in the US forever. That gun debate will never be the same again. But it draws on traditions of activism. So of course the Black Lives Matter movement, 2013, the killing of Trayvon Martin, you might remember they then arrested someone who they released, his killer, got out of prison after a few months or a year or whatever. But it was the Black Lives Matter movement, I think, that really gave huge impetus to student activism in the US. And recently we've seen the Me Too movement and all of that. So there's a lot of that coming from young people. But I think I have to say one of the things that is really a focal point for this is climate change on the activism on the climate change and ecological issues. Simon Sharma this morning, I think he called it the destruction of I wrote it somewhere, destruction of planet Earth or something, the devastation of planet Earth. That is certainly something I think that has caught the imagination of young people because, as they pointed out this morning, they're going to be here a lot longer than just about anybody who's in government or in control at the moment. So let's leave, that's a picture of Mohammed Najem. Let's leave him up on the street for a while where he lives, while I just want to raise a few things. So 3 things for me about activism that I think we need to think about. First of all, activism doesn't necessarily build movements. It can be a flash in the pan, and it doesn't necessarily build anything that lasts, yet it has a message that unifies and something that mobilizes. Secondly, activism, it can also lead to a ghettoization of politics. It doesn't always embrace everyone, and sometimes it can alienate a lot of people. That's something to think about with activism as well. And thirdly, activism can be crushed very, very decisively. It can be stopped, or it can just run out of steam. So those things, I think, are crucial, and we need to bear them in mind when we think about activism. I think it's important to say as well is that even though we're speaking about activism here on the progressive left, if you like, side of politics, there of course is very vigorous activism on the right and on the far right, which is opposed to all of the values, I think, that the activists we've been speaking here would be talking about as well. But I think that's a form of activism that has different beginnings. It certainly, I hope, has different ends, and I'm not really going to address it here. But there are two ideas, I think, that I just wanted to introduce for you that, for me, are quite important here. The one is about intergenerational justice, which on the one hand has been associated with climate change, but on the other there is the sense of how does it apply to everything else. And if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, the whole point about sustainable development is that across all of those 17 goals is that they should not only develop the world in our time, but that they should actually make the world a better place for future generations. Now, the astonishing thing about the global goals, if you read them, they don't say much about youth agency or youth engagement at all. If you listen to the rhetoric now, everyone's, oh, we need young people to help us implement the global goals. But the global goals themselves, I think, are very inadequate on the question of engaging youth. And in fact, they seem to envisage young people as passive recipients all the way through. I think that's a big fault with them. So that's the first thing I want to mention, intergenerational justice, and what does it actually mean for us to take these responsibilities seriously from the perspective of intergenerational justice. And the other, actually, is about maturity. I was, and growing up, I suppose, I'm reading a book by a philosopher called Susan Neiman. It's called Why Grow Up? And I think it's Sustainable Thoughts for an Infantile Age. But in it, she questions our obsession with adolescent culture. She said, this actually is a problem. And the idealization of youth, she questions that. And she seeks an understanding, a model for maturity that is not one of despair and hopelessness, but one that actually really understands the strength that it has. And she says that the point about old age is to be able to live in a world, not old age, about maturity. The point of maturity is to be able to live in a world of painful uncertainty, but not give in to dogma and not give in to despair. That's very significant. A mature person is someone who's able to see the world as it is, but to continue to push the world to where we want it to be. So, having said all of that, what are the three key things that really matter for youth activism? And I want to put forward three, and then I want to hear what you think about them. The first point, I think, for youth activism, in fact, is not to romanticize youth. No tokenism. Let's not bring up a young person and put them on the stage, or find a young person to bring the flowers, or get some young person to be a figurehead somewhere. Let's not do that. Young people are smarter than that. They know when you're not taking them seriously. So let's really think about how we can take young people seriously. Secondly, I want to put forward an argument for youth representation at all levels in all organizations. Sounds like quite a radical thing, but I think there can be a way of doing it. It needs to be rotational because you want there to be a discussion of that kind of representation in young people. But I would argue government, police force, companies, education institutions, why not? I think you can actually make space for engaging young people in each of those spaces. It can be built into the way we think about education. Linked to that, of course, is the whole question of the youth vote. I believe it should be as low as 16, and I think we should be backing things, campaigns that lower the age of the youth vote, but also work to register young people. And lastly, what is my lastly? Oh yes, youth organizations. Build and strengthen independent, autonomous youth organization. I believe government needs to be putting money into youth organization and standing back from controlling it. We need to be thinking of ways to enable independent movements of young people. And the whole point about taking young people seriously is not, as we have done with the global goals, is to say, right, we've worked it out, guys. We've got these 17 points, all these indicators, pages and pages and pages of them. Now we want young people to implement it. If we're taking young people seriously, it's a question of negotiating development priorities with young people, and then it's a question of working out the agenda and the strategy for change with them as well. So these, I think, are the priorities that face us in the way we deal with young people, and I would be very keen to hear what you think about it. We've got, I think, what do we have? We have about 10 minutes, perhaps a bit more, 10 minutes or so to talk about it. So I'd be very keen to hear questions, comments, disagreements. Please. Yes, in front here. Just here.
Hello, thank you very much, Dr. Hugh, for this. First, I'm Syrian, and I'd like to present myself as an activist, but I'm quite privileged because I'm based in Dubai. I have a comfortable life. I go to Lebanon. I work with Syrian refugees, yet I'm an activist. And I'm extremely careful about using activism in the Syrian context, because what we need to realize is that one thing that does not appear enough here is that to what extent we can support activism when there is no accountability and when governments have absolutely no limits to violence, to using violence, to actually rule again by fear. We saw that the Syrian revolution came out because the fear was broken. Now the fear is back. And I'm very happy to see Mohammed Najim here on your screen, but we all know what the situation is, and it's not looking good. So my fear is, as an educator, is like when I'm dealing with young people from my country, I don't want to fool them. I mean, there's something about activism that we need to realize is also how tangible it is within the bigger picture and the bigger system. We don't want to see more people losing their life. That's not worth it. Yet we think that we're building history and we're creating a change, but at what price? So my question is that how can we actually support activism in such context, like really the very difficult context of Syria, for example?
No, I totally respect that question, and I think as well as possibly being not being idealistic about youth, we need not to be idealistic about activism as well. The point about activism is I think you will find that regardless of whether we think it's a good idea or safe or not, these young people will actually come forward, and they are incredibly brave acts. So the sense of responsibility we have as adults and concerned adults is huge. So, I mean, I completely go with all of the problems that you've said. The points that I put forward here, I think, are about thinking about places where we can actually organize in crisis situations. I mean, we just got to be very, very careful. I said that those three young people might not survive yet. You know, I don't think they're being pushed forward by anyone. I would hope not. But it seems as if they have enormous courage of their own, and that's something we can only admire. Yes, at the back there.
So my name's Diane. I'm from the U.S. And I have two questions. One is pretty direct, and I'm just trying to understand why 16, like why that number? Why not 14? I don't know. I'm curious to hear why you got to that number. Yeah. And then just thinking about our context in the U.S., which is very depressing, but also hopeful because of those students. I'm also thinking about just the history with us. Like, we had so many young people who came out to support Obama, and then they disappeared by the second election. Yeah. And that was, fundamental to getting us into the position that we are in right now. So I guess I'm curious about how do you maintain this enthusiasm and this excitement among the youth over time? And it might get at your second point also about rotational youth representation. But I guess I just don't want to see us repeat history. Yeah.
Thanks, Diane. I don't know why 16. If you think it's 40, it's fine. I don't really have a big thing for that. I kind of just had to have a number that seemed better than 18. But I mean, I think that would be precisely the debate, right? But the point about activism coming and waning, I think that was partly the point why I mentioned the Soweto Students' Uprising of 1976, because that activism disappeared actually in the 90s. It was only in the late 2008, 2009 where township activism started emerging again. So even though there was a sense of also at that point demoralization, as there would be with a lot of other movements, and even with youth in America after Obama, the activism does leave lessons and leave a residue. In Chile, we saw that the students picked up on the 2006 momentum, but it took a whole generation after the brutality of Pinochet for them to be able to forget what it was like to be taken into a stadium and killed, and for the children actually to then come forward. So activism is dangerous. We cannot idealize it or romanticize it, but the point is it comes forward and you have enormously powerful young people and they have lessons for social change that are never forgotten, and that will inspire people globally always. Marge, and then at the back. I'll take 2 questions.
It's a kind of question and comment, because thinking of South Africa now and the recent marching for free education in our country was quite an interesting one, because the youth marched for free education because they have to pay for university education. But the state co-opted that, our previous government co-opted that demand and twisted it to the problem being universities, and the ANC youth then twisted the debate for free education to less autonomy for universities. So I'd like to hear your view on the role of political education within youth activism, because without that, youth activism can be used as a tool for government, and we've seen it very powerfully in South Africa.
Thanks, Marge. Let's take the question at the back as well, and then so that there's more time for your questions, and then possibly a question at the back if the other mic can get there. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Alina, and I'm
Hi,
from
Alina.
Malaysia. I'm a teacher. In Malaysia a few years ago, we had this very short movement called Stand Up for Moderation. So instead of
Stand up
going
for?
moderation.
Moderation.
So instead of going all out, the movement was encouraging people to read more, to talk more, to discuss more, rather than go straight into fighting for a belief, which I thought was quite smart, because youth these days are often influenced by a lot of things on social media, and those things might be fake news. We're talking about peer pressure as well. We're talking about going into a movement because everybody else is there, that jumping on the bandwagon bit of it. So what do you think of this? Should we stand up for moderation before we go all out for activism?
Okay, let's hear the last question while I think about those difficult questions.
Hi, Samer from Lebanon. Where do we set the border where activism stops and being an outlaw starts?
Okay, these are all difficult questions. I'll take 3 more. No, let me try. So first of all, the political education. I absolutely believe that's crucial, and I think all of the best activist movements will have some way of coming together and say, what are we learning, what are we doing? Find texts, read, look at other struggles. Even if it's not that organized, it's clear that that impulse is there. I think this is an area where there can be an alliance with teachers. I think, to your point, where it's possible, teachers need to help defend, guide, and nurture this and help students. These struggles don't all take place independently of students. There's teachers involved in a lot of them. And when it comes to moderation or activism, I think it depends very much on your understanding of the words and the cultural context in which you're operating. I think the point about activism is that it's a question of finding the message that works. And that, I think, in a way, is the hallmark of all of these. They've managed to pick up on the things that do work. So equal education in South Africa started in order to build some sense of them being positive and not just anti-everything. They said, okay, the school's got broken windows. How do we fix it? Get together to fix it. But the next question is, who is responsible for broken windows in the school? Okay, that's the thugs in the community. Why aren't they fixed? Who in the government takes the decisions around the budget about, for this, the water, the broken roof? And it grows from there. And the line between criminality and activism, I think it depends whether you're asking a moral question or a legal one. They're very huge differences. I think a lot of these young people will show in their activism a respect for the law, in that they'll take government to court, in fact, wherever they can, use the law where they can, but also they'll stand up against laws that they believe to be unjust. I think the question is the amount of integrity you have. Are you able to say that, yeah, even though this might be illegal, here I stand still, and I'll be taking these points. And this was Joshua Wong's point about going back to being willing to go back to jail. I will stand for the things that matter, regardless. So one last question. You have 17 seconds, so make your point to your question, Melty.
That's me again.
Yes.
We hear a lot of intellectuals blaming the movement of activism in the Middle East because it was not organized, because it was not founded on a theory or ideology. It was momentum, it was ad hoc. And that's where we start the debate between what is civil society about and what is party, and how activism could become more political. What's your say on this? Should activism not develop into something more organized, or just remain?
No, I do believe that, you know, the questions of organization are actually, and movement building are embedded in the idea of activism. Sometimes there isn't time, but it is a huge and difficult issue, and I think it's the key challenge that all of these activist movements face. So we wish them luck with it. Thank you very much for coming, everyone.